Thank you so much for coming tonight. We're so excited to welcome you and our esteemed speaker, Ben Bradlee Jr. I'm Sarah, and this is Anognia, and we're the co-chairs of the student group that is part of the Oak Institute for Human Rights. We'd like to thank President Green and Provost Kletzer for supporting our effort to bring Ben Bradlee to campus, and to all the members of the student committee for doing the hard work to making this event possible. While the Oaks Institute's larger mission is to shed light on human rights injustices around the world, the student committee chose to focus our most recent events on human rights issues on campus. In the fall, the committee focused on the Oak Institute's theme for the year, which was food sovereignty. However, at almost every committee meeting, we ended up talking about sexual assault and how it impacts our campus.
When it came time to start planning events for the spring, we decided to create a series of events centered on the idea of reclaiming sex. In considering what reclaiming sex meant to us, we thought it was important to discuss sex positivity, sexual assault, and the broader cultural and societal norms that shape these conversations. Maeve Dolan, a junior on the committee, came up with a great speaker to be our keynote for this series, and we'll let her explain a little bit more about how this event came to be. Here's Maeve.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. So this past November, I went to see the recently released film Spotlight. It had not yet received an Academy Award for Best Picture, garnered universal acclaim, or had gained the attention of the larger public. I was very moved by the story and the work of the courageous writers and editors depicted in the film. I was so interested that I went to see the movie a second time that same week. I've seen it 4 times total. Later, I found myself mulling over the story and reading about the real-life reporters online. I soon found myself reading a profile of Mr. Bradlee's life and work and discovered that he was a Colby alumni. I was struck by this incredible coincidence. What were the odds that someone whose work had inspired me so much was connected to me in such a concrete way? His website listed an email, and I decided to send him a message to express my reverence for his work, my interest in journalism, and our shared experience at Colby. Although I assumed this would not strike him as it had struck me, and I did not expect to receive a response. Against all odds, within a day, Mr. Bradlee had replied to my email and offered his time to provide a young Colby student with some advice about journalism. I was utterly shocked by his generosity and kindness despite his recent fame. Mr. Bradlee provided me not only with incredible advice about a career in journalism, but also simply with his valuable time. Later this semester, when the Oak Student Committee chose the theme for our spring series, I thought of the courageous human rights work done by Mr. Bradlee and the rest of the Spotlight team. We were thrilled when Mr. Bradlee accepted our offer to come and speak, and are even more thrilled to have him here today. So Mr. Bradlee served in the Peace Corps in Afghanistan from 1970 to 1972. On his return to the United States, he went to work as a reporter for the Riverside Press Enterprise in California for about 3 years. His most recent book, The Kid, The Immortal Life of Ted Williams, has received critical acclaim, made the New York Times bestseller list, and has been optioned for a movie. Mr. Bradlee spent 25 years from 1979 to 2004 with the Boston Globe, 10 years as a reporter and 15 as an editor. As deputy managing editor, he oversaw the Globe's Pulitzer Prize winning coverage of the sexual abuse scandal in the Catholic Church from July 2001 to August 2002, and also supervised the production of a book on the subject, Betrayal, which Little Brown published in 2002. Spotlight, a major feature film on the Globe's investigation, was released in the fall of 2015 and won 2 Academy Awards, one for Best Original Screenplay and one for Best Picture. Mr. Bradlee is portrayed in the film by actor John Slattery. As a reporter, he served on the Spotlight team as the State House Bureau, and as the paper's roving national correspondent. He covered the 1988 presidential campaign of Michael Dukakis, and also reported overseas for the Globe from Afghanistan, South Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and Vietnam. He has authored several other books, including The Ambush Murders, Prophet of Blood, and Guts and Glory, The Rise and Fall of Oliver North. Without further ado, please help me welcome Mr. Ben Bradlee Jr.
Thank you, Maeve, for that overly kind introduction. And thank you for inviting me, and Professor Hatch also. It's a thrill to be back on campus. I'm a 1970 graduate, if anybody was still living in that year. A lot has changed. I'm thrilled to bump into an old friend of mine, Jim Marcos, who is, I think, graduated the year behind me. And he may be here to heckle me for all I know, but be kind, Jim. Anyway, I have fond memories of Colby. I was telling Walter earlier and President Green that I think I was a very indifferent high school student who really only cared about hockey at the time. I was on the varsity hockey team here for 3 years and loved that, and probably quite anti-intellectual. I doubt seriously I could get into Colby these days. I see that they had all the new admits, is that the term? 400 odd, and I'm told this was they admitted the lowest percentage ever. So Colby is getting very elite. Anyway, I'm proud to be part of this series that the Oak Institute is having on sexual misconduct, certainly an important and worthy subject. Sexual misconduct seems almost too tame a term to describe what hundreds of priests did in the Archdiocese of Boston, mostly to young altar boys over the course of many, many years. These were rapes, these were felonies, and they were the ultimate abuses of power committed by men holding positions of moral authority. These were scandalous betrayals, nothing less. This was not an unfamiliar subject for us at the Boston Globe. We had taken a run at other bad priests besides the case at hand that formed the basis for the movie. In 1992, notably, we had done dozens and dozens of stories about one Father Porter from Fall River, Mass, and did some good work, but finally we hit a wall on the story because we couldn't get the internal church documents, which we were able to get later in the John Gagan case, which was the basis for the movie Spotlight. And the documents were critical because it made it impossible for the church to allege media bias, which they did over and over again in our earlier investigation in 1992. Cardinal Bernard Law, who was head of the Archdiocese of Boston, famously called down the wrath of God on the Boston Globe for its pursuit of Father Porter. Don't you love that, the wrath of God? That still sticks in my craw a little bit to this day. But the cardinal is no longer the cardinal. We hit a wall on that story ultimately, so I thought that I was the Metro editor at the time and decided that that was enough. You know, if you don't have it, you don't have it, and you certainly have to be concerned about fairness, and that was important. Fast forward another 10 years or so to 2001, and we had a new editor who arrived at the Boston Globe, Marty Barron. He had come from the Miami Herald. And his interest was piqued by a column that he read by one of our Metro columnists, Eileen McNamara, who wondered, it was a speculative column largely, but she wondered whether Cardinal Law had known about the extent of the abuse of John Gagan, Father Gagan, who had been accused of abusing scores of young boys and had been passed around from parish to parish. And the column speculated that Cardinal Law must have known about this. So Barron called me and Walter Robinson, who, my job then, I was in charge of overseeing the Spotlight team, which was our investigative group, and about 5 or 6 other reporters in the newsroom who did long-term projects. But Barron called me and Walter Robinson in to ask whether we could look into this problem, this renewed problem of sexual abuse in the Archdiocese, and specifically whether Cardinal Law had known about this. I was a bit skeptical at first because of my own history with this story in the Porter case, and we had written so many stories about it. I was frankly a little concerned about overkill, and were we going to the well too often? But it wasn't long before the 4 reporters on the Spotlight team were digging up serious evidence of misconducts by scores of Boston priests over the years. There were inherent problems with getting enough proof, however, so that you could write about this in the paper. One was that the statute of limitations had passed in most of these cases, so charges could not be brought against many of the priests. And most cases had been settled by the church under terms which prevented the victims from speaking out about what had happened to them. And there was the added problem of persuading victims to be interviewed, to go on the record, to use their names about such a personal and traumatic experience. But we were able to develop some key sources who leaked us documents that showed that Cardinal Law was aware that these bad priests, not only Gagan, but others, were being passed around from parish to parish, and this proved that there was a massive cover-up at the highest levels of the Boston Archdiocese, and there had been for years. So the original story we set out to do was to try to find how many of these bad priests there were, but the case at hand was that of Gagan, and he was coming to trial in January of 2002. So I thought that the team should put together what we initially envisioned as a holding story, sort of a scene setter for this trial. But in the course of reporting out that story, we were able to get some critically important documents, including Gagan's psychiatric records and others. And so the story grew in scope from initially a modest scene setter, we call it in the business, to a 2-part series. And it was this story, the more limited story, not the larger story that we originally set out to do and we're still reporting on, which ignited the scandal. The story, you know, in my experience, you in the newspaper business, you never know what story is going to take off and which will not. You can have what you think is the greatest story, but for some reason it dies on the vine. There's just the zeitgeist isn't there, and it doesn't take off. But this story took off like nothing I'd ever seen before. And within 2 days, Cardinal Law, who had refused to comment on the initial story, had called a press conference, and his face was ashen, and he apologized profusely. And watching that press conference on television, I knew that we had a tiger by the tail. And he apologized, and he kept apologizing for 1 solid year, serial apology tour, we called it, throughout the state in an effort to save his job, which was ultimately unsuccessful. We were operating then at the sort of the cusp of the internet era. People might remember in the film, those of you who saw the film, there's a billboard for AOL, which sets the time and place. And so this was essentially pre-internet, but it was the country was coming online, and that helped us spread the story tremendously. The story went viral, as they say these days, and that helped get other newspapers around the country to do the logical thing. They began focusing on their own archdiocese and, of course, finding the same problems that we did in Boston. And before you knew it, the National Organization of Catholic Bishops was forced to devote its semi-annual meeting almost exclusively to the problem of sexual abuse in the church. And by June of 2002, the Pope had called a summit of all the cardinals in the world to discuss sexual abuse in the church. We thought our original stories had impact, and they did, and we were extremely gratified that we were given the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for public service. Our work was over, or so we thought. But 5 years later, 2008, two young and relatively inexperienced Hollywood producers, Nicole Rocklin and Bly Faust, showed up in Boston and came to see me and the others involved and the other reporters. And they said they wanted to make a movie about how we broke the story. We didn't take them very seriously. We never thought a movie would be made, and we were wary about it anyway. What if they made things up and, unduly glamorized it and sexed it up, as it were. But they were persistent, although they found it a very tough sell in Hollywood. It's a grim subject matter. How do you tell it visually? There was a popular new pope by then. Steven Spielberg and DreamWorks signed on, but then they dropped out. So we floundered around a little more. Finally, they got Tom McCarthy, a very noted independent film director, and Josh Singer to come together and write a script. And they came to Boston and talked with all of us, and we were very impressed about how serious they were. And they basically, they talked with us for days, did tape-recorded interviews. We gave them contemporary emails that we had sent at the time and other documents. And they also talked to some of our sources and some of the people who figured in the story. They essentially reinvestigated our investigation. And along the way, they found some interesting things. Some embarrassing things, frankly, to us. One of them that was memorialized in the film, they interviewed Eric McLeish, who was a lawyer for some of the victims, but not one of the good guys, at least initially. He was sort of part of the problem. He was settling cases with the church under terms of confidentiality, so the truth never got out. And we went at him very aggressively, and it's shown in the film. And essentially asked him which side of the story he wanted to be on. Did he want to be a story about that was about simply, degenerate clergy, or did he want to be on the right side of this? Well, the Singer and McCarthy interviewed him. And he told them an interesting thing. He said, in his own defense, that he had given the Globe back in 1993 the names of 20 priests who had committed sexual abuse, people that he had defended. And somehow, I had moved on to another job, and Walter Robinson, the head of the Spotlight team, was then or who later was head of the Spotlight team, then was the Metro editor, and this was McLeish sent over a fax, and you know how many, a paper the size of the Globe must get 1,000 faxes a day, and it fell between the cracks, and it wasn't sufficiently reported on, but it did make the paper, And it was what we say in the business, it was buried. Like you had to go back in the classified ads practically to find the story. And we had totally forgotten. I had never heard of this. I had no memory of it. And Robinson, under whose watch this happened, was mortified and said no, he didn't remember it either. And he said to Singer and McCarthy, well, you're not going to put this in the movie, are you? And he says, yeah, damn right we are. So it was embarrassing, but in hindsight, it was the right call to put it in because it showed that we all that we're human, that we make mistakes, that it's not all heroic work as a lot of it is portrayed to be. So it soon became obvious to us that the trust we had placed in McCarthy and Singer had been validated. They showed us the script. They cared passionately about accuracy. They took when we caught errors in the script, they duly made the changes. And finally, the film pulled together the necessary financing and was greenlit, as they say. And so they began shooting scenes around Boston, but most of it was filmed in Toronto, where they rented a warehouse on the outskirts of the city and recreated the Globe newsroom to a T. And when I walked in that newsroom in Toronto, my knees buckled, literally. I thought I was in my old newsroom. They had photographed each reporter's cubicle, down to details of some guy's girlfriend, and they reproduced the picture just as it was, and more faithful to the detail and accuracy than they really needed to be for the average moviegoer who wouldn't have known. But we were very impressed by that. And watching the filming was fascinating initially. But soon I found it to be rather boring. I would watch a scene be filmed, and you'd think that they nailed it, but they would go on and shoot the same scene about 20 different times. And I wanted to say to the director, you got it already, let's move on. But no, what they were doing, of course, was getting different camera angles for reaction shots of each of the actors. So that was very illuminating. And they were happy to have those of us who came to watch on the set, and they would ask us questions. Like McCarthy asked me one day, well, now when the editor actually edits a piece of copy, does he do it in pencil or ink or red pencil? And I said, red pencil. So they put a red pencil in an editor's hand for that scene. And I happened to be there the day my guy, John Slattery of Mad Men fame, who played me, was filming a scene. And I was standing around, and McCarthy, the director, said, hey, you want to be in the movie? We need an extra for this scene. Are you kidding me? Of course I do. So they waved me in, and I had a cameo in the 9/11 scene. If you blink, you missed it. So, but the next time you rent it on television, look for me. We got to know the actors. The actors, were so impressive. Michael Keaton, Mark Ruffalo, Rachel McAdams. These are leading men and ladies, but they subordinated their ego to be part of this ensemble cast. And they all took, I didn't know that much about the process, and I got a call from Slattery one day, and I'd been a Mad Men fan, and so I was thrilled to take his call. And he says, yeah, this is pretty weird, but I'm going to play you in a movie, and can I come up and talk to you? I said, yeah, of course, come on up. So we got to be pals, and these guys, they just didn't show up to read their lines and get paid. They really wanted to know how the business worked, how we broke the story, and also about our own personal lives. So he and I have had many beers and dinners together, and we stay in touch. So they screened a rough cut for us in midsummer of last year, without any sound, without the sound being properly mixed, or no music yet. And McCarthy and Singer we saw it on just a, like a large television. So it was a totally different experience than seeing it a movie. And but we could tell it was, or at least we liked it then. But seeing it for the first time was just a really emotional experience for us, and that was in Toronto at the film festival that they have every year, and they showed Spotlight in a grand 2,500 seat theater, and so there we saw it on a huge screen with music, with the sound properly mixed, and most importantly, amidst an audience to see how they would react. And that's what we were most curious about, what would be the laugh lines, when would they get emotional, and that was really emotional for each of us. And after the movie ended, 2,500 people, as the credits rolled, stood up and applauded. And we couldn't believe it. And then the director, Tom McCarthy, took the stage, and he called out the 6 main actors who were there, as if it was a curtain call in the theater, but this was a movie. And they came out on stage and they took their bows. And then McCarthy said, now we have a special treat. Here are the 6 real journalists that these guys played. So out we marched, and again, a standing ovation. So you have no idea how weird this was for us, because in newspapering and reporting, you're always taught to keep the first person out of the story. You never write about yourself. So here was this, the mirror was being flipped, and we were being applauded, and it was very, very strange, but very nice, of course. I think it's a great movie, especially because we never thought it would be made and because it was so well done. They managed to make investigative reporting, which is mostly boring, working the phones and pouring through documents, not only cinematically interesting, but riveting. Yet there are none of Hollywood's staples. There's no sex, there's no car chases, there's no explosions. And the subject of sexual abuse was handled so tastefully and well, not through any prurient flashbacks, but by simply letting the victims tell their stories. Perhaps my favorite scene in the film is how they portrayed our biggest break in the case, which was using the church's own directories of priests over the years to build a spreadsheet database that for the first time gave us a grasp of the extent of the problem in the Boston Archdiocese. In real life, this took almost a month to do, but in the movie, it's a montage of about 3 minutes, showing each reporter painstakingly entering the names of different priests into our spreadsheet, set to thrilling music yet. It's important to remember, though, that Spotlight is a movie. It's not a documentary. So some dramatic license was taken. Some scenes were invented to facilitate the narrative and the storyline. Some characters are composites, like the church lawyer who in the movie ultimately confirmed for Walter Robinson the list of bad priests was actually about 6 different lawyers. But overall, the film is remarkably faithful to what actually happened. Despite the success of our stories in the globe, we learned that film itself percolates into the culture much differently than a hard newspaper story does. And the movie has made a greater impact than the original stories did, because we've seen a whole new wave of victims of sexual abuse who have found their voice and been given strength by the movie to come out and tell their stories. We were actively involved in promoting the movie. The studio thought there was value in having the real journalists out there along with the actors. And we learned a lot about the process. And all the studios, they run this like a political campaign. They hire consultants. They wine and dine the 6,000 Academy Award voters. They do special screenings and hold events for them. And they asked us to come to some of those. And finally, this all culminated last February 29th at the Oscars. And of course, having gone this far, we weren't going to miss that. And so we were all invited, and we had the worst seats in the house, up in the nosebleed section, about in the third tier. And there were lots of twists and turns along the night, during the evening. And back here, I don't know how many people stayed up until midnight to the bitter end, but I wouldn't have, certainly, unless I had a horse in the race. But there were twists and turns along the way. There was this other movie, Mad Max, Fury Road, which was winning all these minor awards earlier, and we thought, oh, Jesus, that can be a harbinger of who actually gets Best Picture. And, but no. And then we got Josh Singer and Tom McCarthy got the Best Screenplay. That was a good early result. But the consensus of the Hollywood wise guys was that another movie, The Revenant, I don't know how many of you have seen that, was going to win. And sure enough, they saved the three biggest awards for the very end. It's Best Director, and the guy from The Revenant got that. And then Best Actor, and that was Leonardo DiCaprio of The Revenant. Everyone knew he was going to get it. And then we thought, oh, Jesus, here it comes. The trifecta, they're going to get Best Picture. And then Morgan Freeman came out to announce the Best Picture. And he looked at his thing, and there was a dramatic pause. I don't know if it was for dramatic effect or he was so shocked at what he saw. But it was Spotlight, and we hit the roof. And it was really quite something. One of the real joys that we've had along the way is appearing on panels, discussions with the victims of sexual abuse in the church, and that's been quite an experience. To hear their stories firsthand. And another interesting dynamic that we've seen several times is that people who've attended the events where I and others have spoken stand up and ask a question, and instead of asking a question, they confess openly that they were victims of sexual abuse in the church. And that was incredibly moving to see, and great acts of courage. One of the main lessons from the film, I think, is that sexual abuse in the church remains a big problem, despite some meaningful reforms that the Vatican has made. But there's more work to do. The problem is deeply embedded in the church culturally. The celibacy policy clearly doesn't help, and obviously neither does the fact that there are no women priests allowed. The other main lesson of the film is to underscore the importance of investigative reporting in a democracy. Sadly, there isn't enough of it. As most of you know, newspapers in this country are in real trouble in the internet era. We're dealing now with 2 generations of people who have grown up with the idea that news should be free. They don't want to pay for it. You know, in my day as a kid, we'd get the paper delivered at home, and that was it. Now the internet affords people other options, particularly people who aren't as inclined to read the paper thoroughly. They're just interested in scanning headlines. So when all newspapers have seen drastic declines in their circulation as a result of this phenomenon, and every time they try to put up a paywall, most papers, particularly the local and regional papers, are finding real difficulty in getting people to pay for the product. But when you think about it, what business can exist if they're giving away their product for free? So as a result, a lot of newspapers are in free fall. And in that atmosphere, there have been many, many layoffs. The Globe, for instance, has about half as many reporters as it did in the year 2000. And in that atmosphere, a lot of editors take the view that it's all hands on deck just to put out the paper. And they view investigative reporting increasingly as a luxury that they no longer can afford. I think they're wrong in that. I think investigative reporting is essential, and perhaps we need a new paradigm for newspapers. Perhaps we can't cover every meeting and try to cover every slice of news and not be the paper of record, as it were. Maybe we have to aim higher and generate more original and exclusive investigative reporting, which may take more time, but has more lasting impact. Reader surveys show that people value investigative reporting more than anything else, so cutting back on this makes no sense. After all, the best stories don't come to you. You have to go find them. Like the movie All the President's Men did for my generation, Spotlight has rekindled an interest in journalism from your generation, younger people here tonight. It's been a great morale boost for a troubled and distressed industry. The question is, can it last? I'm hopeful that it can. I'm hopeful that people like Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon, who recently bought the Washington Post, will figure out how to monetize daily journalism in the internet era and make it profitable again. And that different platforms for doing good reporting will continue to proliferate. The fact remains that being a reporter is a fantastic job and a noble calling. I don't know of another job where you can have such fun and have a chance to change the world. Thank you.
So Ben has agreed generously to take questions. There is one microphone over here. Folks who want to ask questions, feel free to come on over. We'll take them one at a time for, what, a while? Okay. Come on up.
Don't be shy.
In the movie, there was a scene where all 4 members of the team were sitting around, and we learned that they all had a connection to the church. And I guess my question is, given that connection to the church, how difficult, or was it difficult, for them to do their job investigating the church in this manner?
Good question. Yeah, the four reporters on the Spotlight team were all what we call lapsed Catholics. They weren't, maybe cafeteria Catholics, or they weren't active church growers, but they had grown up in the church and understood it, and particularly culturally, and I think that was a great asset in their reporting, and helped understand the story more fully, and help with their interviews of victims. Yes, sir.
Along the same lines, do you think it was necessary that your editor was not a Catholic to allow the story to come to fruition?
I'm not sure I understand it. You mean, did he have to be not Catholic in order to,
Right,
for this?
in
No.
this instance, your editor was not
No.
Catholic.
Well, he was Jewish,
Yes.
and I'm not Catholic either. I think the movie makes much of the fact that Marty Barron was an outsider, and I think the implication is that it took an outsider to have the story done. I'm not sure I totally agree with that, but there's no question that he provided a pair of fresh eyes, which often is needed in a situation like that. And he was portrayed in the movie as, culturally alien to Boston, Jewish in an Irish Catholic city. He didn't even like the Red Sox, And, but I think that it was his idea, as I said in my, I don't think it necessarily took an outsider to do the story, and certainly not that you had to be Catholic to do it. Yes?
So listening to you talk really made me think about the way that like a text or an article can influence like a worldview. And I was wondering, like on a more personal scale, if there's like a book or an article that you've read that's really like influenced the way that like you, I don't know, like live your life and stuff like that. Yeah. Or it could be like favorite book or something like that. But I was just interested.
I'm drawing a blank on a book that's made me live the life. I many favorite books, but I'm drawing a blank on that. Sorry.
Okay. It doesn't help to be short. I can't help thinking, and this is more personal to you, was this, doing Spotlight, the movie, kind of like deja vu, considering the same thing happened to your father? And
I've heard that.
Well, it floors me. I'm old enough to remember All the President's Men, and I loved the movie. And it just blows me away that your father was instrumental in bringing down a president of the United States, and you were among the people that were instrumental in bringing down a major cardinal. And I said, how does this happen to one family twice? I just think it's amazing.
Well, you're very kind, and there was a certain symmetry, I suppose, that people have commented on. He and I talked about the story a lot. He died 2 years ago, before the movie came out. But he was certainly aware of the story, and he was from Boston. He was born there and grew up there, so he could relate. And he was a wise ass, my father. He'd call up and say, "Hey, Benji, how the harp's treating you?" That kind of thing. It's off-color, sort of stuff like that. But I'm sure he was. I know he was. He was around when we got the Pulitzer in 2003, and we talked about that. And these were two local stories, Watergate and our story, which had national and, in our case, international reverberations in terms of setting new Vatican policy. So it shows the importance of good local journalism.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you. stepping into the breach, Walter?
That's right. I hope you all won't mind me using a little editorial license here. I'm a former reporter myself, spent 12 years in the business before becoming an academic. And I can't help feel a little defensive about the criticism that is leveled these days against the so-called mainstream media.
Yes.
I mean, I probably participate in that criticism from time to time. I've never used the term MSM as some kind of hateful acronym, but both with the Sanders campaign and with the Trump campaign, I think the media has been targeted as extremely inept, unfair, biased. Do you think this proliferation of point of view journalism, blogging, is an adequate substitute? Is there something lost from the authoritative voice that mainstream journalism used to represent?
Well, good question. I take great offense at some of these portrayals, particularly in the Trump campaign. I don't think he believes it himself. He's got relationships with a lot of reporters, and that I know he likes perfectly fine. But in his stump speech, he'll call back, and in the Trump rally, they put these guys in a pen, literally a pen, fenced in. And he has a shtick that he'll do to his audience, and look at the press back there. They're horrible, and they're dishonest, and this. And I'm very dismayed that you read these public opinion surveys that show reporters are, right behind dog catchers in the esteem in which they're held in the public eye. I don't get it. In a lot of the cinematic portrayals, this is another, one reason I think to applaud Spotlight, that you finally, reporters are being shown in a good light and for what they can do to contribute in society. Too often they're portrayed in movies as just, a baying pack of jackals chasing some politician. Most recently in the otherwise excellent movie that aired on HBO the other night about the Anita Hill affair called Confirmation. That's the only thing you see reporters is just chasing and shouting, and it's unfair. Look, the internet is the Wild West. There's no policemen, so you've got this network of bloggers that spring up and can write anything they want. There's very little editing. So there's been a great loss in the authoritative voice of newspapers. Yes, sir.
Hi, I was...
Oh, sorry.
It's all right. I was in high school when your story broke. I went to a Catholic high school, and I wound up writing a paper about the PR effects of the story breaking. And I got an F on the paper, and my teacher, who is now a prominent lay leader in the Catholic Church, had written "not all priests" on my paper. As it turns out, several years later, reporters were doing their own investigations locally, and they found out that it hit, my archdiocese, it hit my parish, it hit my church, it hit my priest. That was kind of everything coming full circle, but I guess my question is, how do you feel about not all priests and kind of the PR that this has brought on good men who are doing God's work?
Good question. Good question. And I think your priest, or was it an editor who said not all priests? But he had a point. And in fact, I was acutely aware of that during the coverage. And at the height of it, I said I was worried about all priests being tarred by this broad brush. And I said, we gotta write a story about the good priests that are still out there. So we did that, and I think that was an important thing to do. And there's no question that, we wrote a story here. We weren't attacking a faith, and that's important to know. People are, no question, were deeply troubled by this, But in my experience with, having a lot of Catholic friends, they stay with their faith in different ways. They may be saddened by this, but faith is deeply personal. And I think you raise a good point, and it's important to note that there are a lot of good priests still working out there.
Just as to follow up on that, no one's asked yet. Do you feel that the Catholic Church has done enough yet to root out this evil?
No. I think they could do a lot more. And even this Pope, who otherwise is very popular in his tour of the United States, exhibited a bit of a tin ear to the problem when he addressed bishops and sympathized with them for all the heat they'd been taking, when it's really the bishops as supervisors who hadn't done enough about the problem. So they've done some things. They've apologized profusely, but I think they could do a lot more. I mean, chiefly, you can really make an argument, as I alluded to in my remarks, that celibacy is at the root of the problem. But that's not going to change anytime soon, nor is having women priests, I don't believe. I think those two steps would go a long way to changing the culture.
I just want to share that I have great reverence and gratitude for this story being told. And when I went to see the movie, I wasn't expecting to hear Father Porter's name. And I was glad I did, although I don't have a direct experience with Father Porter in terms of me, but 13 of my classmates from North Attleboro had direct abuse by him and rape, as you call it. And I just wanted to share how it started. We had a classmate ahead of us, Frank Fitzpatrick, who tracked Porter down for 4 years because of the abuse that he had experienced with him. I mean, rape, absolute rape. And he finally started taping him, the old way of taping on the phone. And what he did after that was put a little ad in our newspaper, our local newspaper, and all it said was, "Do you remember Father Porter?" And the dam broke in our town. And if this movie had been made earlier, I know 2 of my classmates would be still alive. And the permanence of destruction of these classmates, our 50th reunion's coming up, and we're still talking about it. And a lot of them have seen the movie, and many of them said our classmates would still be alive, and the permanence of destruction would not be there. So, thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Okay, I'm going to start with trying to provide a little levity. I, too, remember your father. My husband worked for your father. We moved down to Washington in 1980. We had just had our first child, and he was working at Doubleday, and he went and asked for a raise, and they said, "No, we don't think you deserve a raise." And then luckily he got a call from, it was the guy who was head of the Syndicated Writers Group, and said, "Howard, I want you to come to work for the Post, and we'll double your salary." And the 2 of us looked at each other and said, "Okay, let's go." So, but one of the things, my husband started out, he wanted to be a journalist, and we all watched kind of the struggles that, was going on with the newspapers. But I think one thing I've learned, the challenges of today are to hold people accountable for their actions, which is why the internet is great, but there's so much misinformation out there and stuff. And I have been very frustrated because there's a lot of abuse going on in a lot of areas, not just sexual assault, but we have issues going on in our hospitals and in our legal system. And we really need newspapers and we need reporters to be out there sort of reporting this information. So, because otherwise people are silent. And if you don't expose that information, you can't hold people accountable. So I have been thrilled. I've seen Spotlight twice, and I sat there and said, "This is great." So I hope you kind of continue the crusade to get more investigative reporting and real reporting. And the newspaper, I'm really enjoying reading the newspaper again. And, when you get rid of newspaper, then you sort of, you don't need newsprint. And in a
Right.
state where we're losing our paper mills and all of that stuff. So it's just something I think going forward, yes, we have new capabilities, but maybe we need to sort of make sure that we, protect and preserve the good stuff that, newspapers represented.
Well,
So,
one key
thank you.
message, I think, is to support your local newspaper. Support the Waterville Sentinel, I mean, what does an online subscription to the Waterville Sentinel cost? Can't be much. And, that's an act of civic engagement that people should support their local newspaper.
But I also think sort of ask for stories that are investigative stories instead of, it's very frustrating right now. If you read the Sentinel, it's always the police report and sort of, there's an awful lot of fluff.
Yeah.
And I would love to,
Well, that's what I suggested in
have
my
these
remarks, that
papers
I think
yeah.
that there ought to be maybe a new paradigm, that, don't cover some of this routine
I totally agree with you.
stuff and put more chips on investigative reporting.
Right.
And I think that's what people really want, and that's what being a newspaper is really all about, to hold institutions accountable.
And I've said this before, you have a wonderful opportunity in Waterville because you've got Colby College, and filmmaking is taking off. So if you can bring all of those partners together, then everybody will thrive and prosper, and hopefully crime will be exposed, and we can move forward. Thank you.
Hi.
I was wondering if you have any regrets in writing this article.
Regrets in what?
Investigating and writing the article.
Regrets about the spotlight stories?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Easiest question of the night.
For coming and for all of you guys to be here tonight. Thank you so much on behalf of us and Ben and the Oak Institute and the Oak Student Committee.
If we could just have one more round of applause for Mr.
No, thank you. Thank you.